Hello, and many thanks for joining us in our first Skates Art Industry Hangout here. My name is Gabriel Butu, and this is the art market in 2012-2013. The discussion is provided to you by Skates Art Market Research, which is the must-have resource for informed buying, selling, collecting, and financing of art. Skates will be running a series of art industry hangouts like this one with art market experts from across the globe, covering a range of topics and using the technology provided to us by Google with its recent Hangouts feature. Today's conversation is a high-level overview of the past year of trends and events in the art market and a look ahead at what we can expect from 2013. We are joined by an international lineup of art market experts spanning the globe today from New York to Sydney. Kelly Crow is a staff reporter covering the art world for the Wall Street Journal, formerly with the New York Times. Michael Plummer is principal and co-founder of ArtVest Partners, formerly with Christie's and Sotheby's. Both of them will be joining us from New York today. And we have Nick Forrest, who runs one of the foremost art market blogs, the Art Market Blog, who is joining us this morning, tomorrow for him, from Sydney, Australia. So thank you everybody for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So I'm going to jump right in with the first question, and I'll start off with Kelly. And the question is, which trends did you note in the art market in 2012?
Sure, I'm happy to go. Happy to go first. I think that let me collect myself here. Certainly, I thought it was a roller coaster ride because you kept getting all of these nice mixed signals of news, reported by me and others of masterpieces selling for these record prices. But then you would also see in the auctions sort of the sell-through rates on a lot of the fair to middling stuff really bombing out. And so I think for collectors, there was definitely this feeling of sort of a retreat to safety wherever they could find it, and they were almost willing to overpay for things if they felt like it was the Scream. And yet, then the sales in London for Sotheby's, which sold the Scream, a month or two later in London, they tried to sell off a whole bunch of sort of mediocre material, and collectors, turned their noses up at it. So I think there's definitely an interesting distinction there between the trophy market and the everything else market. And I think for sort of one of the few ties that really bind this market is that you saw that trend happening in China, you saw it in Russia, and you saw it here in New York. I feel like the Americans were a little bit more of a rosy story this year. I kept noticing them showing up not only at major auctions and being dominant players, but certainly in the art fairs. I just got back from Miami a few weeks ago, and I probably couldn't count on one hand how many European curators I saw, but Americans, just about the entire hedge fund industry from New York flew down, and they were definitely buying things. Maybe not north of 2 million, but certainly below that. They were writing checks left and right. So that, to me, it's an interesting thing when you see kind of the whole market kind of take a breath and try to decide where they want to spend their money, and yet there's not a lot of other great places to put it right now, and stocks sort of can evaporate the value of those things overnight. So I think in some sense the American contemporary market, where you saw certainly some of the most speculation, is also where you see a lot of investors placing a lot of faith. So there's lots of, it's kind of a very frenetic market, I think, and one where the readings, you keep taking them, and then you need to keep retaking them because they keep changing. But those are some initial thoughts.
Great. Nick, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think I totally agree with what Kelly has said. I think there's definitely been a kind of focus perhaps on blue chip works, focus on art as an investment as well has certainly increased, and the focus on value and value for money I think is particularly important as well. So I think there's a lot of, by the looks of it, collectors who are kind of reevaluating perhaps some of the other mediums opposed to the paintings and such, looking at drawing, and looking for different areas within different periods and such that perhaps offer value for money, as opposed to the tens of millions of dollars people are paying for paintings. So they're looking within there's periods that are making that are popular, but like searching for value for money within those periods. Also, I think there's been quite a bit of interest in photography as a medium as well, and I think there's also been a general trend where we've seen perhaps artists gain a little bit more power in the market as well, and perhaps have more of the ability to choose who they're represented by and how they're going to be represented. The other thing I suppose I've noticed, there's also been in terms of the newer artists that are coming through, it's been a bit of a kind of a focus on those artists who perhaps reflect some of the characteristics and aesthetics of some of the more previous avant-garde groups of artists. So I think perhaps we're looking to the past in order to see what's going to be happening towards the future. There's been a bit of a reflection of that as well. And I think lastly also a greater kind of trust in bidding over the internet. We've seen, I think, online auctions, proliferation of online auctions and of the online platforms. And I think, in terms of it, we've got art fairs, you've got the auctions, and we've got, just the general online art stores are becoming a kind of a favoured hangout for all collectors and investors. So, and also in terms of the kind of brokering of art as well, there's been a lot of new companies coming up through the online sector that are offering those type of services through the internet. So that's what I've noticed.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, Michael, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, I think we look at the auction data and indices to try and get a sense of the market because I agree with much of what has been said already, but there is to expand on what Kelly said. There has been, in the spring of 2012, average auction prices reached the same amount as the same levels as they did pre-crash in the spring of 2008. But in the fall of 2012, we've seen a different marketplace. Contemporary continues to be quite strong. Although in the middle tier, less quality works, there is weakness, as Kelly points out. But as a sector, it's performing quite differently than other sectors, such as Impressionist and Modern and American and Latin American and all of the other sectors out there. And this is an anomaly. This has never happened in my career to date, that the contemporary sector is so outperforming other sectors. And it really, up until like 2000. I think it was 8 or 9. Impressionist and Modern was the biggest sector. Contemporary was the second biggest sector, and then Chinese was the second biggest sector. In 2011, Impressionist and Modern had fallen to second, Chinese had risen to first place, and Contemporary was third. And now, Impressionist and Modern is the third biggest sector, Chinese is the second, and Contemporary is the first. So you're seeing this jumping around between second and first and third place. And I think that speaks to some significant shifts, that Europeans aren't as active in the market as they used to, so they're not supporting the Impressionist and Modern market. There isn't the quality of property in the Impressionist and Modern market these days that there was even 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. The Chinese market has really cooled down significantly. If you look at the data coming out of Asia and Hong Kong, that you're seeing sales levels that are down by 30 or 40%, mostly driven by the mainland Chinese and dropping their buying. So it's created an unusual environment, one that we don't have a precedent for. So I think that but then in the midst of all this, you have the contemporary sales of Sotheby's and Christie's last month did exceptionally well. They exceeded even the auction houses' estimations. I'm sure Kelly has even more insight into this than anybody. But everyone was blown away by how well they performed, and that creates this I think vacuum in the market, because you have the auction houses are drawing in all the secondary market material and leaving the dealers with less secondary market, good quality secondary market material to sell. So one of the offshoots of that was that you go down to Art Basel, Miami, and I think, and many other observers did as well, that this fair had more interesting, more diverse, more original material, which was also came out of necessity because all of the good secondary material, or much of it, or a large volume of it, is going to the auction houses. The dealers had to stretch themselves and go out and be more engaging with younger artists and newer artists and be more adventurous. And I think as a result, we had a better fair. But I think the economics of the art market are really undergoing a change right now, and it's going to create some very interesting dynamics in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And so, thank you for that. And you mentioned, a few events in there. I mean, the art market is so much an events-driven kind of market: auctions, art fairs, that sort of thing, biennales. Would you like to continue, Michael, and kind of speak to some of those watershed moments throughout 2012 that may be kind of the key events for the art market and how they performed this year?
Yeah, I think back to Nick's point about technology, I do think that this is one way where the combination of event selling and technology are actually radically transforming the economics of the art market as we watch. And I think it's going to be exacerbated in 2013 and could be exacerbated even more if there is some sort of cooling in the art market. But for example, I went to the Frieze Fair in New York, which was new this year, and I was talking to some of the dealers there, and it was interesting to see that a lot of the major dealers, big names, had welcomed the Frieze Fair because they found that oddly, illogically, or counterintuitively, that the big collectors were prepared to go, who were in for the auctions in May, were actually more prepared to go out and spend time on Roosevelt Island than to go spend a couple of days or a day or two down in Chelsea. That the event of the fair had created momentum that was a counterbalance to the auctions that actually drew collectors back into the galleries or back in to see their works. So that was a real boost in the arm, but it then sort of creates this dynamic. Then why have a storefront? Why pay for a gallery all year round when your big buyers are only coming into town for fairs and are buying from you at Art Basel, at Frieze, or at Frieze New York, or Frieze London, and Hong Kong, or at Art Basel, Miami. So that what I think we're going to start seeing more and more of is the big guys, the Gagosians, the Marlboroughs, the Mitchell and Nashes of the world are going to keep their spaces. But I think a lot of the middle players are going to be squeezed. And I think they're going to start asking the question, why am I having a gallery when I'm spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on art fair booths, and I could also sell online and have follow-up sales online. So that I think we're going to find a winnowing out that these middle guys are going to be squeezed. I also think they're being squeezed in terms of product because the bigger guys can really do justice to these artists and promote them more and better, and the middle guys don't have the budgets for that. So I think we're actually undergoing a consolidation in the art market. It's slowly happening. I think those people in the art fairs and people like us are seeing it around the edges, but I think it's going to become more of a trend in the next couple of years.
Okay,
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
And Nick, yeah, I mean, so Nick, you're in Australia, which is
Yes.
a strong art market in itself, but it's quite far removed from, the New York, London kind of route, the Miami and Basel kind of scene. Would you like to speak to some of the kind of events? You're closer to the Asian market down there. Events going on in that area, and what your vantage point is telling you about the art market globally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think definitely in terms of art fairs, the art fair has become a much more significant event for the Australian market. I think because of our proximity to the Asia Pacific region, we've got some major art fairs in the region. Especially we've got the Singapore art fair coming up, and there's a lot of Australian galleries that have chosen to take part in that. And there's also been a number of galleries that have recently actually closed their spaces in Australia to focus solely on trading through fairs and also via online as well. So I think there's definitely a shift in the way the dealers are actually looking to actually get business from their works and through the Asia Pacific region, and real estate's just so expensive everywhere, to be able to justify having a gallery when most people are actually going to the fairs and they can find their clients there anyway. They may as well not have that cost and have that opportunity to go to the fairs and perhaps even potentially gain more clients and have their work shown to a wider group of people. So that's definitely something that's taking hold here, and a lot of the galleries in Australia are now taking part in those major Asian art fairs and playing a significant part in the development of them as well.
Where does Art Hong Kong come into that, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think definitely, Art Hong Kong is one of the major ones. I think it's perhaps for some of the Australian galleries, it might be one that's perhaps a little difficult to actually get involved with. But they've taken more to perhaps some of the other ones, like Singapore is one of the ones that has really been extremely popular with Australian galleries. So I think they're looking more towards those newer fairs, the ones that are perhaps not dominated by larger international galleries. They're looking to kind of make their own mark on some of the other Asian fairs, perhaps other than Hong Kong.
Thanks. Yeah, and Kelly, we've just had astronomical fall sales, and just off the back of Art Basel Miami. What are your thoughts on these kind of watershed events and peaking, quote unquote, again? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Again, I feel like we're getting interesting mixed signals from the market because, on the one hand, as the guys have mentioned, the Christie's rolling out this huge Warhol sale, and they sold most of it online. They're selling most of it online, and the sell-through rates and sort of the global turnout from that sale is really encouraging and underscores sort of almost, in some sense, this idea that maybe the art market is becoming this big homogenous migratory pattern, right? And that if you can just lock into the right current, that you can survive the ups and downs of various sort of microeconomic factors. On the other hand, I'm seeing this really interesting segmentation where like at Art Basel Miami Beach, there was very little Asian art and very little Asian collectors, I think almost by design and by coincidence. So the big mainland guys from China didn't come all the way over to Miami. They didn't sort of sink in with that current. And, honestly, a couple of the Shanghai dealers that I talked to said that when they milled around in the booths, that the American dealers and whoever else was in Miami didn't know who they were, didn't know what kind of money they had to spend, so to speak. By the same token, when I was at Art HK in Hong Kong, tons of amazing, Asian art, but not so much Latin American art. I mean, there's sort of this interesting segmentation where I think the fair is trying to become both a regional hub and yet bill itself as a global stopping point. And I think only a handful of collectors with the stamina and the pockets deep enough really make the full circuit. I think their collectors are beginning to make some winnowing choices about which niche in the market they want to stay plugged into, and which stops along the route they want to bow out of. So I think in the long run that will be an interesting thing to watch. If in fact, in all amid this talk of globalization, if we're much more homegrown than we realize, or that we realize is sustainable over the long haul. The nice part about that is when you go to Art HK, you see lots of collectors from Indonesia and Singapore and Taiwan really collecting pan-Asian. They're not just collecting Chinese vases anymore. They're also collecting their own guys, but they're also kind of collecting across the region. And that kind of cross-fertilization, I think, could be really good for the Asian art market moving forward, especially if China itself keeps being a little gun-shy. By the same token, I'm definitely going to be watching what's going on in South America this year. I feel like Brazil, through Art Rio, and also just through a lot of the big Western galleries going down there, Gagosian and the like, they're really scouting for what I think could potentially be a fourth hub. I think they're kind of making this case that there needs to be somewhere outside of New York and London and China. And I think Brazil and Colombia, some of that money down there is trying to assert itself. So whether or not there's the institutional support or the import-export taxes to support that kind of buying on a regular basis, I think Brazil is certainly an area, in Colombia too, that I'll be keeping an eye on this year. Let's see, what else was I curious about? Yeah, the other thing I think would be interesting to watch is to sort of pick up on what Nick said before about artists as free agents. I feel like this free agent model has been flirted with by Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons to some extent, but now you see Yayoi Kusama picking up where they might have kind of one anchor gallery, and it may not be the biggest gallery in the world, but they have sort of somewhere that they call home base, and yet they really take on shows in a project-by-project basis. So, you know, you have artists like Mark Rochon who, you know, shows at Gagosian 1 minute, and then the next minute Blum and Poe, and then the next minute at any number of different galleries. And essentially, you know, this contract idea of an artist asking a gallery to see them through thick and thin, I think is really morphing into a model where the artist, almost like movie stars, you know, take on projects if they want to work with that director, and if they don't, then they don't. The exciting part is that's a level of autonomy that I think artists really haven't enjoyed, you know, potentially since Michelangelo, and even he had to answer to the Pope, you know. But like now, these artists can take on projects as they want, and ask for the terms that they want, and ask for resale rights, and ask for all sorts of carrots that really haven't been historically at the fingertips of major artists, at least not in a really codified sort of way. The scary part about that is that I cannot think of an artist who hasn't had an off season or an off year. And I think if you can maintain a really long career, there's going to be a little bit of ebb and flow. And I think sort of in the ebb is where the gallery really pays its way, right? Because they keep finding homes for your work even when you are no longer part of the fashion cycle. So I think I will definitely be watching to see what sales happen for, not only for Koons's big major sculptures, but for, you know, for those canvases and for some of those smaller pieces, which in moments have been harder to move. So I think it'll just be Hearst. I mean, Hearst is another great example of that. So yeah, that's certainly an interesting trend. I think it'll be fascinating to watch how they navigate that new terrain.
Before we,
I just think.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Sorry. I was going to say something interesting that happened here in Australia recently that I think might be of interest to people internationally. There's been kind of a lot of primary market artists in Australia whose work is now appearing at auction, and the dealers are kind of not particularly happy with this, obviously. So there's one really interesting situation where a very young artist's work ended up appearing at an auction, and the dealer, in an effort to, I suppose, deter people from purchasing the work at auction, refused to give copyright for the images to appear in the auction catalogue, thereby not allowing anyone to actually see the works basically in the catalogue and deterring people from buying them. So I think that's kind of perhaps something interesting as well, as to, you know, we're seeing this kind of this merging of all the different sectors within the art market. You know, I think the auctions and galleries and all these kind of, they're all merging together and kind of going into each other's territory. So I think it'll be interesting to see perhaps in next coming year what effect that has, and, you know, whether how the galleries, you know, will kind of wield their power, and perhaps how the auction houses will kind of wield their power in terms of the kind of greater scheme of things. So I thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know, Michael, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to something Kelly said, and you know, talking about this globalization and regionalization of art fairs at the same time. I think she's absolutely right. I do agree Latin America is underserved at the moment because, I mean, Art Basel Miami Beach actually does serve that market, but there's nothing local, more local than that to that market. But I think what's curious to note is that the folks that own Art Basel then brought Art Basel Miami Beach here in 2002, and then bought Hong Kong art, the Hong Kong Art Fair in, I guess it was a year ago, 9 months ago. I can't remember the exact chronology here, but what's interesting is one company has this global footprint, and they are responsible for choosing the galleries that go into each of these fairs, making those decisions, or the dealers that they choose to be on their committees to choose those galleries. So you have sort of one entity making these decisions now, or delegating those decisions and controlling those decisions. So this globalization and regionalization or these two main art fairs that everyone talks about, the circuit of fairs, is one business entity. And I just think that that's just something to take note of in an industry where we already have a duopoly between Sotheby's and Christie's. We now have this other entity that's more or less controlling the highest end of the art fairs. And while an art fair like Singapore, as Nick points out, I think that's very telling that the Australian dealers don't get into the Hong Kong fair so easily, because that's really the market for the Gagosians and the Paces and the Marlboros and the others, as we said, who are also in Miami and also in Art Basel. And they're relegated to Singapore, which Singapore is not really yet as global an art fair. It's not really attracting the same crowds or caliber as are the three Basel-owned fairs. But Singapore, it's good that there's another outlet for the Australian market, because Singapore is hungry to put itself on the map. As is Rio, as are the others. Everyone's trying to get onto this global circuit party, as it were, of art events. But Art Basel still sort of holds pride of place, or the Art Basel group.
Yeah, no, it's MCH is the company, right? And that's quite a powerful entity. Speaking, I just want to digress one more time quickly on this topic before we look ahead to 2013. Kelly, you mentioned a couple of artists there, Damien Hirst, Jeff Koons. I think Gagosian came into a couple of answers. Hirst has just left Gagosian. Koons has a show at Zwirner early next year. Emmanuel Perrotin is due to be opening a gallery here on Gagosian's turf in New York, and he does represent Takashi Murakami, another big Gagosian artist. With all these big entities and major institutions, Gagosian being one of them, what does this say to you in these recent developments about that powerhouse?
Well, I think he's been experimenting for the last few years with trying to kind of reinvent the gallery franchise model. I mean, for the longest time, galleries were, sort of kind of exclusive clubby destinations, if you will, and you walked through the doors of this club. There's no bouncer, there's no rope, but certainly there was a vetting process that happened when you walked in, and if you were, considered part of this club, then you got sort of access to all these amazing pieces, not on the walls, and you were invited to dinners, and you were a part of a community, and sort of, you got to know these artists, and there was kind of a friendly atmosphere, more along the lines of a boutique, if you will, with your own personal shopper assigned to tip you off when really good things came into the store. I think now with this franchise model, what it is that sort of no matter where you are in the world, right, wherever you're vacationing or traveling or going for business, that there is that franchise on the corner. It's been really interesting to watch him, roll that out. But it will be also interesting to see, the growing pains that come along with that kind of a model. Because, I mean, if you look at sort of what he did, putting all the, Damien Hirst has all of those spot paintings, those polka dot paintings. And, Larry put them in every single one of his galleries last year. I mean, every single one. And I don't know what more a dealer can do for an artist to keep an artist happy than to say you will be in 11 or 12 gallery shows all at once around the planet. I think and that still wasn't enough to keep Damien there, because he would rather be a free agent. So I just think it will be interesting down the line. Again, I think he's going to have to tailor those programs in each one of those galleries around the world to suit the local audience that will be there month in, month out. And I think that is, again, much more of a recreation of the old model, just sort of writ large. I don't think the franchise model, just having, the same Gucci handbag in all the different stores, I don't think that's going to work. And I think he's definitely trying to tailor those different spaces to suit the different local audiences. I do still suspect that a lot of the work is selling upriver, that it is being shown in different shops around the world, but that it's actually most of the sales are being brokered out of New York, which is a lot of overhead. But he tells me no, so we will see. I do see still a lot of jockeying on the chessboard of galleries trying to figure out where the best money is in any given moment. So you still see a lot of galleries opening up second outposts in London, or Lehman Mopin opening in Hong Kong. I heard a rumor that a couple of big major galleries are thinking about going in and getting a warehouse in Hong Kong together. Two galleries who would normally not sit side by side in any other sort of petri dish, but because it's Hong Kong, they're just thinking of maybe sort of, splitting a big space sort of, next door to each other. So I think there are still galleries who are trying to figure out sort of how far they can stretch, how many different outposts they can maintain in any given moment. And again, it's all good while the money's still coming in. It's all good while there are still an influx of collectors. But this is a marketplace that has grown into such an 800-pound gorilla that it really needs a pretty steady influx of new and I would argue a little bit naive money to come in and just spend really carefree. As soon as collectors start pulling back and being super discriminating and plugging holes in their collections rather than just going on spending sprees, then very quickly I think there's going to be a bit of a reckoning. And I think for the galleries, they're thinking, hey, let's explore some of these other outposts while we still can, and then we'll just see if we can ride it out if it gets bad again. So so far I think this year has been much more chipper than last year, even though some of the sales would refute that. But people still feel just a little bit more comfortable putting some of their extra cash in art than they do in some other alternative assets. There is that feeling that they could still pull that Picasso off the wall and roll it up if they had to, get out of town quickly. So I think as long as people still feel that way, they're still going to think about art as something that they want in their portfolio, and they're still being a little bit of adventurous about, where they place their bets, if you'll forget that kind of terminology.
Yeah, no, right. That's right on. So, I mean, we are at the end of a very turgid year. Michael, how's 2013 going to look?
Well, I think we are, barring no sort of unexpected cataclysm or fiscal cliff, and news today looks like there might be some hope that there's a settlement there, or the world economy going into recession. I think that we're still probably looking at, we're looking at the contemporary market continuing to do pretty well, at least for the first 6 months of the year. I do think 2013, other sectors are going to continue to be cool, meaning Chinese art, American art, 19th century, Impressionist and modern, decorative arts, things like that. I think there is a certain coolness there that's going to be maintained that we saw in the fall of last year. But I think, to Kelly's point, there is a vibrancy amongst Americans. Other than the fiscal cliff, I think there's a general sense that our economy is coming back. I don't think that the impact on taxes, we have no reason yet to believe that the impact of increased taxes is going to, in the short term, affect American collectors' buying habits, but it could longer term. We have to see what that's going to entail if taxes do go up. But yeah, I think we may be looking at a world where there has been no precedent for, where the contemporary sector sort of continues to boom and everything else is rather cool and if not disappointing, at least lackluster. So.
Well, I would just add too that jewelry is another area where we're seeing some surprising strength too. So I think that jewelry is is definitely being treated like a safe bet. So that's another. I think contemporary market and jewelry seems to both have a global cachet. That I think those are just interesting choices. That those are the two things. I think both contemporary art, the art that isn't in the history books yet, and no one has made a final ruling on whether any of it is worth anything, and jewelry, which has always been a hard asset by every definition of the word. So it's an interesting yin-yang there of strength and risk.
And I definitely
Watch sales are very popular. Go ahead, Michael.
I was going to say I definitely agree with what Kelly says, that people are being driven into this by concerns about the safety of other investments and other assets. There really is, there really is this belief out there that people need the safety of having part of their wealth portfolio in hard, tangible assets, and that is what is very much driving this the contemporary and the jewelry boom.
So that's art as an investable item, more so than a luxury good, would you say?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Nick, would you like to expand at all on 2013, maybe from more of an Asian perspective?
Yeah, sure. I think 2013 is definitely going to hopefully be the year of perhaps the kind of Southeast Asian markets. I think particularly one of the really strong markets is Indonesia. I mean, you've got a massive population, and there's also, there's a few auction houses around as well. There's some great artists coming out of the country as well, looking at also Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia and Malaysia. Are also looking as though they're pretty strong emerging markets as well. So I think that will hopefully be something that will be good for 2013. But I mean, in terms of here in Australia, one of the biggest kind of trends has been movements in terms of galleries. Within a lot of gallery mergers, and there's been a lot of gallery closures. There's been a lot of dealers who have closed their galleries and are choosing to go to sell via fairs. And also, interestingly, I think something that's a global trend is they're also choosing to kind of present pop-up shows as well in various different locations around Sydney and in Australia, and also around Asia Pacific as well. But I think as as more galleries kind of try and develop an Asian presence, hopefully that will have somewhat of a positive effect on Australia as well. But I suppose, on a more general note, in terms of the art market for 2013, I think perhaps the online the online market's going to become stronger. I mean, just in end of November, we saw the record for most expensive artwork auctioned online, which was by Via Christie's Live. It was Edward Hopper work for $9.6 million. So I think that'll certainly that shows greater confidence in the online sector, and I think also that investment, that whole artwork as an investment, I think that's just a factor that's driving the market really strongly. And I think there are so many more services becoming available for people who would like to invest in art, so many more advisory services and ways of investing that are not just your typical purchasing a work of art and sticking it on the wall. So I think it's becoming a much more viable option for people who perhaps don't know much about the investment value or don't have the expertise or the facilities to be able to invest properly and with the knowledge that they need. The last thing, I think galleries are kind of looking as much as they can to try and find areas where they can develop or suppose differentiate themselves from other dealers. And I think some of them are actually kind of looking towards the philanthropic model as a way of adding a little bit of something different to their gallery structure. And I think that might be something that develops in 2013. As galleries try and find new ways of bringing in clients and bringing new people to their business, even if it is philanthropic, it'll still give them new clients.
Right. So yeah, alternative kind of distribution channels and models for that. Kelly,
Yes.
Are we going to see more auction records next year?
I think if you've got, the world's best Picasso or, one of the other Screams or, something really iconic, I think, yeah, I think now would still be a pretty decent time to bring it out because the auction houses are going to market that thing to the stars and shop it around the world. And there are still, I think something like 1,700 billionaires in the world. So there are still a lot of people out there that are willing to spend some serious money on a real trophy if it's really deemed that. And I think that you are already seeing auction houses scout for new money and all sorts of interesting pockets there, playing up the Caucasus a lot lately. Christie's sent a lot of its Impressionist and modern works to Baku a few months back, and now just earlier this week I got a notice from Sotheby's saying that they're doing a selling exhibition, of in the Caucasus of various art from that region. So there's, always this hunt for both the great old master, paintings and by that I just mean, literally old masters, but also just anything that really is deemed a masterpiece. It's such a lopsided supply and demand type of a business that if you just happen to have the one painting that, a handful of those 1,700 billionaires in the world would really love to own, I think you're in pretty good stead. The question is, if you have the third or the fourth best, do you just hang on to it, or do you feel like now is still the best time to put it up? Because that to me is a tougher call. And I think certainly once you put a picture up for sale, if it does not sell at auction, it really does carry this sort of burn book feel about it. And I think again, I don't know how I would go on that decision if it were someone that I cared about who was thinking of putting something like that up for sale. The hunting grounds are also changing in interesting ways. I think you're seeing a lot of Chinese auction houses scouting in the States for their pieces because a lot of third and fourth generation Chinese immigrants still have a lot of amazing pieces that their ancestors brought over in San Francisco, let's say, or out in California. And for them, America is the best place to go looking for art right now. So that's fascinating. And then, gosh, I'm trying to think. There's lots of other just interesting places, I think, where people are looking for art and trying to make, sense of where's the best place to put it. So I think that will be just an interesting thing to keep an eye on moving forward.
Mm.
Yeah,
I'll just add one other thing.
Go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, I just on something Kelly was saying about works that haven't sold. I think it's kind of the place we're at the moment with the art market. There's just so many sales, so many auctions. I think what I've seen is that I think the market's become somewhat, in a way, immune to works not selling. Perhaps we don't focus on it as much as we should, and we focus solely on what is selling, and the kind of so many of the records that are coming up and all the big prices. So I think that perhaps we are not looking at what's not selling as much as we should be, and are focusing a little too much on what is selling. But anyway, I think that's just something that's just come through as a bit of a trend, I think, as well.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us today. I don't know if anybody has some closing comments they'd like to make before we tune out.
Well, I think art is still just a whole lot more fun to analyze than any other of financial reports. So it's a great big chessboard to play around in, and I think that collectors should absolutely do as much due diligence as possible before wading in. But it's definitely more fun than having framed posters on your wall, and I think it's certainly a creative field and a fun one to roam around in.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us in this first Skate Art Industry Hangout. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and see you next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.